Welcome to ID the Future. I'm Robert J. Marks, broadcasting with Discovery Institute's Center of Science and Culture in Seattle, Washington. This podcast is part 2 of an interview with Dr. Winston Ewert about his work at the Evolutionary Informatics Lab concerning algorithmic specified complexity. One of the things that I thought was interesting, because I'm a co-author on the paper, is that you applied this idea of algorithmic specified complexity to the game of life. I tell the game of life to most people and they think of the Milton Bradley game. And when I was a boy, it actually came out with a picture of Art Linkletter, and all of the money had a picture. And you don't even know who Art Linkletter is.
I do not.
Okay, well, since they have removed the picture of Art Linkletter, and you can buy the game of life. So is your work applied to the Milton Bradley game of life?
No, it's not.
Okay,
so
what is your game of life? Is it totally different?
It's totally different in every way.
Okay.
The game of life was originally developed by a mathematician known as John Conway. And the game of life is a cellular automata. The idea of the game of life is that you have a large grid. And this grid is populated with cells. And most of the cells at any given time are dead. And there's a few living cells. As each time step happens in this simulated world, some simple rules are applied, which cause either cells to be born, to die, or to just remain there. And so if you were looking at a particular configuration of cells, they would undergo this rule. And the interesting thing we found is that different patterns do different things, and they basically function as really simple machines. For example, there's a pattern known as a glider, and it's a particular configuration of cells in this world that if you put in the cells and you watch it, it will actually move across the grid. So it'll start in your current position, and then after 4 time steps of the simulation, you'll find the exact same pattern, but shifted down and to the right, or possibly different directions depending how it's oriented. And so that gives us sort of this simple machine inside this game of life.
And if you'd like to see some of the examples of the game of life, simply go to YouTube and type in for your search the game of life. You will just find some of the fascinating elements here. There's also not a hobbyist, but a site where people play around with the game of life. This has become an obsession with some nerds.
Yes, there's certainly some people who are very interested, and there's some people who've gone through and they try and classify all the machines they found. They do things like say, well, if we put a bunch of random cells, which we call ash, what kind of machines show up there? They try to build more complex machines.
Now, I think you and I disagree with this, but I look at ash as kind of the primordial soup in a way, to see if anything complex will develop from it. What is ash?
Ash is essentially, if you've populated the game of life with random living and dead cells, so instead of actually deliberately putting a machine there, you put the random cells there and say, okay, what shows up? And it's kind of like a primordial sort of origin of life soup scenario where you put it down there and see what emerges from it. It's somewhat question of to what degree can we apply this to the primordial soup is, of course, the rules of physics in the game of life are not the same as rules of physics in reality. So we want to be a little bit careful trying to say, well, we don't see any self-replicating machines showing up in the game of life. Does that mean self-replicating machines wouldn't emerge in real life? Well, I wouldn't want to quite make that argument. Because for algorithmic specified complexity, I have to have an estimate of the probability.
Yeah.
The ash is really telling me what the probabilities of things are. They
Okay.
have low, because if they came up with the ash, they actually had low algorithmic specified complexity.
So what are some of the classes of patterns you've seen? These hobbyists in the game of life have actually classified these patterns in different elements. What are they?
The most basic pattern you have is a still life. And a still life is a pattern that if you put in the game of life, it sits there and does nothing. Now that's not very exciting, but it is different than many patterns which would actually change into something else. You also have an oscillator pattern. An oscillator pattern would be one that switches back and forth, perhaps even going through several time steps, but it always comes back to the original pattern. So it actually doesn't change in the end, but it goes through several stages into there. And actually, if you think about it, a still life is essentially an oscillator, which actually repeats every time instead of going between multiple states. But then you also have a spaceship. Now, a spaceship is a construction of the game of life which moves across the board. And I mentioned the glider earlier, and the glider moves across the screen, and that's one kind of spaceship. But there's various other spaceships of varying degrees of complexity that people have put together that move across the screen at different speeds and in different directions. What I've always found interesting is the glider gun. And the glider gun is sort of like an oscillator, except for the fact that it shoots out gliders. So actually it forms a new glider and shoots it out through into the rest of the area of the game of life. That's why it's called a glider gun, because it shoots those. There are, of course, many more patterns, but those are somewhat the most famous examples.
All of a sudden, I would just make a note. I think Dr. Ewert just killed a mosquito flying in midair. Did you? Was that
I
it?
think I missed it.
You think you missed
tried.
it? Okay. Well, we appreciate the effort here. We'll keep track of the mosquito and keep our listeners up to date on what is happening there with the mosquitoes. So already you have hobbyists naming things in accordance to things which are within our experience. A still life is something that doesn't move. We know that there are things that don't move. My wife would say that I don't move. She would call me a still life sometimes. And then there are gliders. The concept of motion. We're familiar with motion, so there's been a class associated with motion. So already we see context being applied here to the different classes of these patterns that occur in the game of life. You applied algorithmic specified complexity to look at some of these patterns, and what did you find out?
What we wanted to do is be able to describe these patterns, because of course part of algorithmic specified complexity is to compute the description of the pattern, the Kolmogorov complexity. So we devised a mathematical language for describing patterns based on what they did. Does it move? Does it repeat itself? Does it shoot other patterns out? Does it do all these kinds of things? And given that language, we showed how you could describe all these various patterns as different kind of descriptions. And given the length of the pattern, you could do that. And then we tried to estimate the sort of basic probability of these patterns. Now, the problem is we can't actually get a good estimate of most of the probabilities because most of these patterns have never shown up by random chance. We can't get a good estimate of the probability.
Would you say that most of these patterns, at least the complicated ones, were designed by hobbyists?
So yes, there's definitely a delineation between those patterns which have shown up in various random configurations out of ash and such, and something like the glider has shown up that way, versus other patterns which have only been shown up by being designed by hobbyists.
But the glider is very simple.
The glider is very simple. There's like 5 cells in it. So certainly that we could say there's these simple patterns that they show up, and there's these complex patterns that only show up when they're designed. And somewhat what we'd like to do with ASC is we think, well, we should delineate these into these 2 categories. We have to estimate the probability, and we couldn't get a good estimate of the probability, of course, because, well, I don't know how probable it is for a glider gun to show up in the game of life because no one's ever seen it. But we can say, well...
Nobody's ever seen it
no one's ever seen
generated by chance.
No one's ever seen it generated by chance. But we can say, well, we figure the bigger it is, the less probable it probably is. So we basically adopted a simplistic estimate based on the number of cells in the pattern.
Okay.
And so we used that to plug into ASC, and we calculated the algorithm specified complexity for all these different patterns.
So how did your results match what intuition says about design? We have intuition when we look at Mount Rushmore that it's designed, and Mount Fuji that it wasn't designed. We have a certain intuition about these patterns that occur in the game of life.
Well, certainly it showed basically that the very complex patterns that we find that people have put together exhibited under our model high algorithmic specified complexity, which fit our thing. The sort of meaningful constructed machines should have this high degree of specified complexity, and that's in fact what we found. And we found if we look at random ash that shows up, those based on our model don't have a lot of algorithmic specified complexity. Now, there are a few cases that things show up much more probable than you might expect under our model, and we noted those in the paper. But in general, we found that our model estimate actually seemed to work fairly well.
Great. I'd like to mention that there is a very fascinating relationship between cellular automata and biology. In fact, one of the professors in my department, Dr. Keith Schubert, likes to go into extreme environments and look at these kind of weird life forms that exist in sulfur caves and just incredibly extreme environments. And the people that are interested in this are people like from NASA, because they wonder what would happen on extreme environments on other planets. The model that he is using to understand these extreme life forms is cellular automata. And he's actually using variations and generalizations of the game of life to try to get a handle around there. There is a direct relationship between some of the work that you've done and biology. In fact, if you're interested, Dr. Schubert's work made the cover of National Geographic a few months ago. Very fascinating article.
We actually can, using short descriptions, describe functional machines. And there can be no doubt that there's immense amounts of functional machines in biology. And the most basic form of functionality is that protein folds into a particular shape. The first order approximation, no proteins fold. The point being that there's actually a very rare set of proteins that actually fold, and that rarity makes them improbable, but the fact they fold is actually a very simple concept, which means effectively that we actually can describe that most functional building block using algorithmic specified complexity. We can go all the way up through, is this a cell that actually can move? Is this an eye that can see? And all these different kind of machines. And so the idea with applying it to the game of life is to say, look, we can, in this carefully controlled simple model, absolutely mathematically describe these structures, which would be difficult to do in real life because it's more complicated. The same essential idea applies. And so the idea is we can show we actually can compress these functional machines we find in biology using the notion of corner of complexity, and thus show that they do in fact exhibit algorithmic specified complexity.
Excellent. And I think that the implications for intelligent design are probably pretty obvious, aren't they?
Yes, I think somewhat intelligent design is contingent on being able to show this specification. And if we can't show that these machines are in fact specified, then we have no basis for objecting to Darwinian accounts of them, no matter how improbable.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Ewert. We also want to talk about, not in this podcast, but in a subsequent one, about the application of algorithmic specified complexity in images. And we'll do that next time. Thank you, Dr. Ewert. You want to say goodnight?
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Say goodnight.
Good night. Is it night when you're listening to this?
No. Say, there was an old George Byrne, thanks. It said his wife was Gracie, and he would always say goodnight, Gracie, and she would say goodnight, Gracie. It was funny. Okay, so you want to do that? Say goodnight, Winston.
Good night, Winston.
Good night for ID the Future. This podcast is part 2 of an interview with Dr. Winston Ewert about his work at the Evolutionary Informatics Lab concerning algorithmic specified complexity. An upcoming third podcast by Dr. Ewert deals with the topic of using algorithmic specified complexity in assessing meaning in images. This program is recorded by Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright by Discovery Institute 2016. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com.